Hello and welcome to On Becoming a Healer with Saul Weiner and Stefan Kertes, two physicians reflecting on how better self-knowledge makes us more effective in medical practice and education and is essential to joy in being doctors. We do this in this podcast by telling a story and reflecting on themes of judgmentalism, engagement, boundary clarity, ego, and caring. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
So, Saul, what are we talking about today?
Well, I wanted to share with you a story about an episode I observed actually on a plane, believe it or not in a hospital, not in a clinic, that made me think about what are the characteristics of somebody who's a healer. And the thought occurred to me because I've realized that having a heart of a healer is not really specific to being a physician or a nurse. One can see it everywhere. And quite honestly, it's often missing among those who we wish had it. So this was just an example that kind of got me to thinking, and I thought it would be useful to maybe talk about it.
So this is not an airplane medicine case?
No. So actually what happened is the plane had landed, and actually I'd flown back from a meeting to Chicago, which is where I live. And, O'Hare is a hub for people who are flying all over the world. And sitting a couple rows in front of me was a bunch of people who didn't speak English. I think they were flying back to somewhere in East Asia, just based on the sound of their voices. And they were older people. They looked like they were in their 70s. And what happened is after the plane landed, we were approaching the gate, the airplane stopped, and the pilot came on and he explained that there was going to be delay and that we weren't going to be able to pull up to the gate for a while to debark. And it took a few moments before the folks in front of me understood what was happening. And then I could see that they were starting to get agitated. And I figured out that what was probably going on is they were anxious because they needed to get a connecting flight to wherever they were flying. And as you can imagine, it's pretty anxiety provoking when you're sitting there waiting and not knowing when you're going to get to your gate and you've got to fly somewhere far away. And then on top of that, they were not English speaking and they were somewhat older. So all of that put together. And to be quite honest, didn't occur to me that this was my problem. In fact, I remember thinking to myself, thank God I live in Chicago. And, I have like white noise headphones and I put those on and I took out my laptop and I was like, oh, it's a good time to work on a manuscript. And that was about it. So that's me. And then all of a sudden I noticed that just to my right, a couple rows up, this young looking guy, probably in his 20s, gets out of his seat. He was very casually dressed. He was wearing a t-shirt. He had like flip-flops on, just, very casual. And he had been working on his computer. I could see he had some spreadsheets there. I don't know whether he was like doing some kind of business work or IT or whatever. But he gets up and kind of walks over to this group of older people. And he doesn't speak their language. He's obviously American. And he pulls out his iPhone. He starts interacting with them. And I realized that he's trying to help them figure out what their connecting flights will be and where they would go. He's pulling up their gates for them and just kind of one by one explaining to them, even though it's across a language barrier, showing them where they're going to need to go so that, whenever they pull up to the gate, they'll be able to move quickly. And then on top of that, he then opens up the overhead and just takes down their bags and puts their bags right in the aisle so that...
Let me just verify. So can I just verify that he is breaking a few rules as he's doing this? We can come back to it, but I want to make sure that's correct, right? You're on the tarmac and he's going around talking to people and getting their bags down, right?
Yeah, that's actually a good point because I don't remember the exact part of it, but I'm sure that in a situation like this, they always say on the overhead, seatbelts should remain fastened, et cetera, that usual drill about like, please stay, seated, don't take down your bags, all that kind of stuff until we arrive at the gate. So yeah, that's a good point. That had probably already been said. And so he's kind of blowing that off.
So, and so then what happened?
Well, what was interesting is I could tell that this was very therapeutic. These passengers just started to calm down. They just calmed down. Like all of a sudden, I guess they felt some sense of control. They knew what to do. And he just quietly went back to his seat and, just went back to work. But I could almost feel like the anxiety level had gone down. And I'm sure they weren't completely calm because they didn't know when they were going to get pulled up to the gate. But then when the plane pulled up to the gate, everybody let them get off first. I don't know if there was an announcement about that. They usually say if you have a connecting flight, you go first. And so they got up, they had their bags ready, they went off the flight, and off they were. And then I was just kind of watching him, and I noticed that he was just working on his laptop. I think he quietly watched them get off, and then he just got his own bags down, and he ambled down the jetway quietly, and that was it. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, that's more valuable than an MCAT if I were trying to figure out if somebody should go to medical school. Like I was thinking, look, he's in his 20s. And if I were trying to come up with a test for like who should go to medical school, I'd be like, that guy just passed the test with flying colors. And I, it just got me thinking about, what it means to be a healer. And this guy did this so unselfconsciously.
Yeah. And hearing this, I recognize that a lot of the people that we cultivate to become physicians, doctors, potentially other high-level professionals in health have a lot of things going for them. But the idea of just trying to help other people out and make sure things get done and people feel better isn't necessarily clearly expressed, at least in the people that we see day to day.
No, absolutely not. And it's certainly not something you can measure on a multiple choice test. I've come to think of this as an organizing, I've written about this idea of organizing principles, this idea that people live with organizing principles. And it was something I talked to my mentor, Simon, about a lot. And I think it's a term that he coined. And so the idea that you're trying to make the world a better place is kind of an organizing principle. It's one of the things that makes you tick every day. There are lots of things that make people tick. Getting rich can be an organizing principle. Being famous can be an organizing principle. I mean, these are all organizing principles that to differing degrees play out in each of us.
And so with this guy, our best guess is that his organizing principle is caring in some basic way.
Yeah, absolutely. He may not be aware of it. It may not be something he ever thinks about, but if you look at that behavior, and behavior is everything, that's what I saw.
So within medicine, we struggle a little bit with how would we cultivate or how would we build that, or things that get in the way with that. And I think I'm sort of curious if you have reflections on either how we cultivate it or things that stop it.
Well, I hope that almost everybody who goes into medicine does have healing as at least one of their organizing principles. I think that the question becomes, what other organizing principles do they have? And are those other organizing principles, are they compatible with the organizing principle of being a healer, or are they just sort of competing organizing principles? So for instance, if their organizing principle is to make boatloads of money at all costs, that could definitely conflict with being a healer as an organizing principle. And I think, unfortunately, we read stories about doctors who get into situations where they're, Medicare fraud and even worse. And so that would be an example of and I don't know if those particular doctors even had healing as an organizing principle, but they might have, but they may have been just kind of so seduced into another organizing principle of get rich that their healing organizing principle may have just become completely subsumed. So I do think that most people who go into medicine probably have it as at least a component, although probably not all of them. But it's really a question of what else is going on that's driving them.
Is it possible that there are aspects of medical practice or the environment of practice that literally drive it out of us? I mean, sometimes people will say, and I'm going to come at this a few different ways, but one possibility is, the conditions of work are so difficult with the bureaucracy and the demands of the administrators. I can't care anymore. What do you think of that idea?
Well, one of the things I remember thinking about as I watched this young man amble down the jetway and I kind of followed him, sort of thinking admiringly about what I had just observed was, gosh, I wonder what would actually happen if I put him in medical school. Like, we take this young man who is so unselfconsciously helpful and we basically say to him, for the next 4 years, you're going to be judged on how you do on a whole bunch of multiple choice tests that require spending hours and hours memorizing incredible amounts of material. And then you're going to have to present cases to attendings, et cetera, all the stuff that happens. What would happen to this young man? Like, would he still be jumping out of his seat to help people who are trying to make it to a connecting flight and who don't speak English? And I think that's the question you're asking.
Yeah. And I maybe can put a finer point on it by reflecting on myself. Maybe this isn't, maybe I'm not generalizable, but I certainly have felt at various times, but especially in the first 15 years or so of medical school and training and the years thereafter, part of me really was excited about individual people and wanted to connect to them. And part of me was just desperately nervous about whether I would remember to order the right test and whether I could figure out how to order it on the computer and make sure that the result came back to me. And the competition between these things sometimes was so overwhelming that I think I was a bit curt or not necessarily all that good at staying engaged with the patient in front of me. And I worried that I might even come across as not caring. So is it, I think I was in conflict in some ways. And I guess I want to know, was I ruined? Did I ruin myself? What's going on there?
I think one of the great challenges of life is learning to balance competing organizing principles. And I say competing as opposed to conflicting. Conflicting is a big problem. But I think what you're describing are competing organizing principles. On the one hand, you have a caring instinct and you want to be helpful to your patients and engage with them and find out exactly what's going on with them. At the same time, you're very mindful of the time you have before rounds, for instance, and the need to, you want to look good for your attending. And I'm just sort of imagining you as a resident for the sake of discussion. And, as a result, you want to double check and make sure that you've looked up the latest studies and so forth. None of that is in conflict with being caring towards your patient, but it certainly could be competing with it to some degree. And I think that striking that balance, having the judgment to know where to draw the line on it, sort of overreaching in one versus the other, is one of the great challenges of our lives and as physicians.
I would extend and say that acknowledging that there's competing demands, competing feelings about what we're doing and need to get done is healthy and helpful, and that there can be long periods of time where that competition does feel uncomfortable, even when you're doing good work. I would have appreciated it if someone had said to me back maybe 15 years ago, I know you feel uncomfortable right now about how you're managing this, but guess what? You're in it. You're doing decent work. It's not going to feel right every day. When you go home at the very second you close your computer or whatever, you're not necessarily going to feel you did your best, but it might actually be pretty good. Don't sweat it if what you're worried about is getting the right things ordered and also being kind and responsive. If that's your competitive zone and you don't feel perfectly comfortable at the end of the day, you've been more or less in the right space. Don't worry too much. I would have appreciated that, actually.
Yes. And I think you're getting at a really important point here, which is that people who go into medicine are really hard on themselves. And we often find ourselves in sort of situations that are, in a sense, unreasonable if we're hoping to be terrific in every aspect of what we've been asked to do. In other words, we have to compromise. And I think for many people who are sort of perfectionists, that is seen as a personal failing. And that, of course, leads to exhaustion and burnout and demoralization. And I think what you're getting at is somebody has to say to us early on, look, man, be like water, chill. Essentially, be self-aware of the situation you're in, that you can't be everything, and then use your mind and your heart to figure out how you're going to balance those competing responsibilities. So in the sense that you described, you're on the one hand trying to have meaningful interactions with patients. You want those interactions to be engaged, to be nourishing. And at the same time, there's a lot of stuff you need to do with the computer. There's a lot of stuff you need to look up, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to say to yourself with a sense of awareness that you can't do it all, here's how I'm going to strike that balance. And given the time and the resources I have available to me, and then you're going to live with that. You're going to say, that's what I'm going to do today. And you're not going to feel bad about it.
Now, I just need to comment that you channeled the great martial artist and movie maker Bruce Lee there with your expression, be like water. So you get a few cool points for that today.
Thank you.
Now, let's talk about conflict. So sometimes these things are not just a matter of being like water. There is fundamental conflict between caring and whatever the hell we're doing as doctors. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think, for instance, I talk about in my book on becoming a healer a couple of situations, some pretty pernicious and bad and bordering on illegal or illegal, and others that are much more subtle. The more subtle one is where, for instance, you're not the corrupt physician who is fraudulently billing Medicare and ordering unnecessary procedures so that you can, rake in the big bucks. That's unethical and illegal. I'm talking more about the physician sort of on the other side of the spectrum who maybe is in primary care for the right reasons, but is has moved into a community where it's the suburbs and everybody has a bigger house and a nicer car and maybe makes more money. And all of a sudden you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm not enjoying my work that much anyway. And if I see more patients, I can get a little bit richer and I won't have as much trouble buying the car I want. And you find yourself going down a slippery slope where maybe you're cutting corners and it's because you've started to, want to catch up with the Joneses. Now I think that's an example where we're moving from competing into conflicting organizing principles. And I think that is pernicious and it can happen to doctors. And that's where I think it becomes important to sort of have the awareness to stop and say, hey, what's going on here? Am I drifting away from what I value about myself? And that I think is an important capacity. It's something we need to be able to do to check ourselves when we're headed down a path that ultimately may be self-defeating.
So maybe the issue of unselfconscious caring, which is how we started this with the young man on the airplane. Maybe the hope here is that most people have some degree of that. And what we want to do is unlock it and help them to express it rather than the notion that in the first year of medical school, we're going to implant that in you. Is that fair to say?
Yes. And I think the way to unleash it or to preserve it or to maintain it is to nourish it. And the way you nourish it is through engaged, genuine human connection. It's by leaning forward. It's by connecting with patients with a sense of shared humanity, rather than just seeing them as work to be done. There's so much about the way we're trained that makes patients just a list of tasks to complete. And I think that's the path that leads us into a sense of exhaustion and burnout. It's pushing back and saying, no, for me, every interaction is an opportunity for some sense of meaningful, nourishing connection. That, I think, is the way we keep ourselves feeling refreshed and connected to the healing part of what brought us into medicine in the first place.
I appreciate that. I think I'm going to continue maybe on a process of working on leaning into the caring and also recognizing when I see my colleagues do that, because I think sometimes it's the students, the residents, the nurses, others need to see that we see it, that I see what you just did there, and it was remarkable. I don't think I have additional thoughts beyond those. I just want to ask if you have a last thought that you want to fade out with here.
Well, next time I'm on a plane and I have to choose between a manuscript and helping out folks who are struggling, it's going to be a tough call. Maybe I won't put on the white noise and go into my manuscript. Maybe I'll take inspiration from that 20-year-old and get off my butt and help.
Amen, brother. Thanks a lot for talking with me today.
You bet.